Chapter 22 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 22. The Liberal Candidate and his Precursor. Jemima did not know whether she wished to go to Abermouth or not. She longed for change. She wearied of the sights and sounds of home. But yet she could not bear to leave the neighbourhood of Mr Farquhar, especially as, if she went to Abermouth, Ruth would in all probability be left to take her holiday at home. When Mr Bradshaw decided that she was to go, Ruth tried to feel glad that he gave her the means of repairing her fault towards Elizabeth, and she resolved to watch over the two girls most faithfully and carefully, and to do all in her power to restore the invalid to health. But a tremor came over her whenever she thought of leaving Leonard. She had never quitted him for a day, and it seemed to her as if her brooding, constant care was his natural and necessary shelter from all evils, from very death itself. She would not go to sleep at nights, in order to enjoy the blessed consciousness of having him near her. When she was away from him teaching her pupils, she kept trying to remember his face, and print it deep on her heart, against the time when days and days would elapse without her seeing that little darling countenance. Miss Benson would wonder to her brother that Mr Bradshaw did not propose that Leonard should accompany his mother. He only begged her not to put such an idea into Ruth's head, as he was sure Mr Bradshaw had no thoughts of doing any such thing. Yet to Ruth it might be a hope, and then a disappointment. His sister scolded him for being so cold-hearted, but he was full of sympathy, although he did not express it, and made some quiet little sacrifices in order to set himself at liberty to take Leonard a long walking expedition on the day when his mother left Eccleston. Ruth cried until she could cry no longer, and felt very much ashamed of herself as she saw the grave and wondering looks of her pupils, whose only feeling on leaving home was delight at the idea of Abermouth, and into whose minds the possibility of death to any of their beloved ones never entered. Ruth dried her eyes, and spoke cheerfully as soon as she caught the perplexed expression of their faces, and by the time they arrived at Abermouth, she was as much delighted with all the new scenery as they were, and found it hard work to resist their entreaties to go rambling out on the seashore at once. But Elizabeth had undergone more fatigue that day than she had had before for many weeks, and Ruth was determined to be prudent. Meanwhile, the Bradshaws' house at Eccleston was being rapidly adapted for electioneering hospitality. The partition wall between the unused drawing room and the schoolroom was broken down, in order to admit of folding doors. The ingenious upholsterer of the town (and what town does not boast of the upholsterer full of contrivances and resources, in opposition to the upholsterer of steady capital and no imagination, who looks down with uneasy contempt on ingenuity) had come in to give his opinion that nothing could be easier than to convert a bathroom into a bedroom by the assistance of a little drapery to conceal the shower bath, the string of which was to be carefully concealed, for fear that the unconscious occupier of the bath bed might innocently take it for a bell rope. The professional cook of the town had been already engaged to take up her abode for a month at Mr Bradshaw's, much to the indignation of Betsy, who became a vehement partisan of Mr Cranworth. As soon as ever she heard of the plan of her deposition from sovereign authority in the kitchen, in which she had reigned supreme for 14 years. Mrs Bradshaw sighed and bemoaned herself in all her leisure moments, which were not many, and wondered why their house was to be turned into an inn for this Mr Donne, when everybody knew that the George was good enough for the Cranworths, who never thought of asking the electors to the hall; and they had lived at Cranworth ever since Julius Caesar's time, and if that was not being an old family, she did not know what was. The excitement soothed Jemima. There was something to do. It was she who planned with the upholsterer. It was she who soothed Betsy into angry silence. It was she who persuaded her mother to lie down and rest, while she herself went out to buy the heterogeneous things required to make the family and house presentable to Mr Donne and his precursor, the friend of the parliamentary agent. This latter gentleman never appeared himself on the scene of action, but pulled all the strings notwithstanding. The friend was a Mr Hickson, a lawyer, a briefless barrister, some people called him; but he himself professed a great disgust to the law, as a great sham, which involved an immensity of underhanded action, and truckling, and time-serving, and was perfectly encumbered by useless forms and ceremonies, and dead obsolete words. So, instead of putting his shoulder to the wheel to reform the law, he talked eloquently against it, in such a high priest style that it was occasionally a matter of surprise how he could ever have made a friend of the parliamentary agent before mentioned. But, as Mr Hickson himself said, it was the very corruptness of the law which he was fighting against, in doing all he could to effect the return of certain members to Parliament, these certain members being pledged to effect a reform in the law, according to Mr Hickson. And, as he once observed confidentially, if you had to destroy a hydra-headed monster, would you measure swords with the demon as if he were a gentleman? Would you not rather seize the first weapon that came to hand? And so do I. My great object in life, sir, is to reform the law of England, sir. Once get a majority of Liberal members into the House, and the thing is done. And I consider myself justified, for so high, for, I may say, so holy an end, in using men's weaknesses to work out my purpose. Of course, if men were angels, or even immaculate, men invulnerable to bribes, we would not bribe." "Could you?" asked Jemima, for the conversation took place at Mr Bradshaw's dinner table, where a few friends were gathered together to meet Mr Hickson, and among them was Mr Benson. "We neither would nor could," said the ardent barrister, disregarding, in his vehemence, the point of the question, and floating on over the bar of argument into the wide ocean of his own eloquence. "As it is, as the world stands, they who would succeed even in good deeds must come down to the level of expediency; and therefore, I say once more, if Mr Donne is the man for your purpose, and your purpose is a good one, a lofty one, a holy one," for Mr Hickson remembered the dissenting character of his little audience, and privately considered the introduction of the word holy a most happy hit, "then, I say, we must put all the squeamish scruples which might befit Utopia, or some such place, on one side, and treat men as they are. If they are avaricious, it is not we who have made them so; but as we have to do with them, we must consider their failings in dealing with them. If they had been careless or extravagant, or have had their little peccadilloes, we must administer the screw. The glorious reform of the law will justify, in my idea, all means to obtain the end. That law, from the profession of which I have withdrawn myself from perhaps a too scrupulous conscience," he concluded softly to himself. "We are not to do evil that good may come," said Mr Benson. He was startled at the deep sound of his own voice as he uttered these words. But he had not been speaking for some time, and his voice came forth strong and unmodulated. "True, sir, most true," said Mr Hickson, bowing.